Ooh. Okay. Very well. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this episode of the ISWUTT podcast. My name is Michael Graham, and I will be your host this evening. Before I jump into anything that we're going to be covering this week, I would like to take a moment and so kindly ask all of you to go follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at ISWUTT Podcast. That is ISWUTT Podcast. Facebook.com/ISWUTT Podcast. And Anchor.fm/ISWUTT. Once again, that's Anchor.fm/ISWUTT. If you go to Anchor and you feel so inclined to help me build out my setup so I can provide the best possible content for you in the future, you can go Anchor.fm and you can kindly give a donation. I'd like to give a shout out to Paul. Great man, Paul. Paul gave us a nice donation last week. So if you're looking to be better day to day, be like Paul. Go to Anchor.fm/ISWUTT and donate. So that way I can get my mixing set up, my mixing board. I can get that wonderful mini fridge oven iron. With that said, let's go ahead and let's get into it. This week, we are going to be covering what some call the Great Mortality, some call the Pestilence, the Black Plague, the Bubonic Plague is what we're going to be covering this week. So, the Bubonic Plague, for those of you that don't know, is an illness that swept through Europe. Killed a lot of people. The death toll was significant. Estimates of this death toll, because of this sickness in Europe in the mid-1300s, is anywhere from 30 to as high as 60%. So this sickness claimed a minimum of 25 million people, or more, depending on which estimate you decide to follow. And currently, Europe has the population of almost 750 million, according to what I'm reading here. 741.4 million as of 2016. So that would be the equivalent at the conservative 30% estimate of 225 million people dying now because of that. If this were to happen again through Europe, hopefully it doesn't. I don't think it will. I mean, currently our healthcare is significantly better. Our science is significantly better than it was in the mid-1300s. So in the mid-1300s, these traders in Europe, they heard rumors of this sickness, mortality, pestilence, this plague that is sweeping through Asia, but only rumors. But from 1347 to 1351, the sickness swept through Europe. And the way that it started and really got to Europe, we need to start with a city called Kaffa. Now, the city of Kaffa is known as Theodosia. It's a pretty sweet name for a city. But at the time, Kaffa is a booming trade city. And it's in the Crimean Peninsula, if I may say that correctly. And it was largely inhabited by these Genoese traders, these traders from Genoa, Italy, which is one of the largest cities in Europe at the time, especially trade cities. And this city of Kaffa had these beautiful docks, and they claim, okay, these docks can harbor over 200 ships at one time, which is a large amount of trade coming through. So in the mid-1300s, Kaffa was an impressive trade city, port city. It had a population of about 80,000 people. It was just south of the Silk Road that led from Europe to Asia. That was the main routes where they would get all of this trade coming to and from Asia at the time. And it was a fantastic trade city because they would have all kinds of people coming in. High-end goods, low-end goods. It doesn't matter what goods. They were all going through the city of Kaffa. So they would come in from these silk trade routes and then go to these docks with over 200 ships sitting there and taking these goods and then spreading the goods all the way through Europe where people could buy and trade. So as I said, perfect mix of goods. Now, one thing to know before we go deeper into Kaffa is at this time, the Mongolian Empire had split into 4 different factions. Now, even though the Mongols were split, they were still a very, very powerful group with one of the greatest militaries the world has ever seen. And the faction nearest to the city of Kaffa was called the Khanate of the Golden Horde. That's a pretty sweet name for an army as well. The Khanate of the Golden Horde. I can't imagine if you are going to take up arms and go against a group and you hear, oh, they're known as the Golden Horde. Doesn't sound too good for me. So keep in mind that this Mongol group, the Khanate of the Golden Horde, is still very, very powerful. And really, the city of Kaffa only stood as this trade port because the Mongols allowed it to stand. They didn't take it over because as the trade was taking place in the city of Kaffa, it was lining the pockets with gold to the Khanate. Coming to and from, as these goods are traveling through, you bet that Khanate is taking a piece of it. And they're saying, well, all of the trade that's going on, so I don't destroy your city right now and take this over, yeah, you got to pay me. But by the mid-1300s, the Genoese that lived in the city of Kaffa and the Mongols that were surrounding it, there were rising tensions, both political and religious. And there was very little from stopping the Mongols from taking over, aside from the fact that the trade was taking place and they were getting money. They were getting buku bucks. They were lining their pockets with gold. There was a small town just north of the city of Kaffa, and one night a fight breaks out and an Italian man kills one of the Mongols. And as soon as the local Khan hears about this, he shows up at the town, at this small town with a large army. The Khan's name is Yani Beg. And the Khan says, look, you have 2 options here. You either surrender and give us everything we're asking for, or you face a siege. You face my army destroying your small town. I think a majority of the time, when you have this massive army that's world-renowned for erasing cities completely from history, shows up at your doorstep, you're going to give in to what they want. But not in this case. Not in this case. The Genoese in this small town decided, yeah, we'll face this army. And things went exactly how you'd think they would. Very, very quickly. The small city is destroyed. And the Genoese hightail it all the way back to the city of Kaffa, not too far away. But as the Genoese traders are heading back to the city of Kaffa, the Mongols weren't just going to give up and say, oh yeah, you killed one of our own, no big deal. They were holding on to that resentment, saying nobody attacks us. You got to keep in mind, we're the ones who pretty much control all of Asia at this point, big parts of Europe. So as the Genoese traders headed back to Kaffa, the Mongols pursued them. And when the Mongols arrived at the city of Kaffa, they realized that the city of Kaffa has impressive walls, and they decided, instead of just taking our horses and trying to roll up on these walls and beat them down and take over the city, that it would be in the best interest of keeping their people alive to enact a long and drawn-out siege of the city. However, during the siege, the Mongol army began to fall ill, and they started dying off, but not one at a time. They were dying off in very large numbers. While this was happening, these walls of the city are holding strong. But with the Mongol army dying out so quickly in a matter of weeks, these people that are inside the city of Kaffa, the Genoese traders, are looking over and they're saying, oh, we're spared. We're spared. Our God has brought us the fact that these guys are sitting here ready to destroy us, but now they're dying off on something we didn't even do. Our God has brought retribution over these Mongols. Not quite. The Mongols decided that with the amount of people they have dying off and the amount of catapults they have, these trebuchets, guess what they did? They decided to load up their catapults with the bodies of the dead and hurl the bodies over the city's walls, directly into the population. And at this point, when they decided to start doing this, these bodies were so far gone These bodies were already decomposing so much that if a body was flung over these walls and it hit anything in the city, instead of just a body hitting a wall and bouncing off or kind of rolling around on the floor, these bodies were decomposed. They had all kind of gases and ooze, things falling apart. So if a body was launched into this city, when it hit something, it would explode. So if you're unfortunate enough to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a body flies over this large wall and it hits the wall next to you, it explodes and you're going to be splattered with this almost like milkshake of human guts. It's quite vile, if I may say so myself. So in the weeks that follows, the bodies kept being launched and launched and launched, and eventually you gotta think, man, these bodies are really stinking up the joint. They're smelly. It's disgusting. They're making everything all dirty. So the rats that were following this Mongol horde, this Mongol golden horde, started to follow the scent of these bodies that were being launched over these walls, and these rats eventually made their way into the city of Kaffa. With the rats come the fleas. With the fleas comes the plague. And very quickly, the city was infected. Now, if you remember what I said in the very beginning here, Kaffa was a city that harbored over 200 ships. And those ships were going to and from all of these different places in Europe. They were going to Italy, to Constantinople, to Iberia, Spain, Portugal, surrounding areas. So while the siege is going on and people are starting to get sick and they're dying off in droves in this city, the people that could make it out did their best to hop on these ships and get out of Dodge. They got to go. But one thing to note is that rats at this time loved being on these shipping vessels. The vessels are dark, it's wet, it's cool. It's almost like the perfect location for these rats to go and collect and then start reproducing. It's not uncommon in the mid-1300s for shipping vessels to be infested with rats. So the rats go on the ships. And guess where the ships went? Everywhere. They went everywhere in Europe. As I just said, they go to Italy, they go to Constantinople, they go to all of these different countries. If you actually look at a map of the city of Kaffa and really the trade routes that were going on by sea at this point in the mid-1300s, it's almost like a spider web. It really goes out. So one city is directly importing and exporting to 30 other cities. So when one boat leaves this city, it's going to go to another city. As soon as the goods get to that city, who knows where they're going to end up? It could be another 30 cities. So one to the next, the next, the next. It's a very vicious cycle of trade. In this case, it's a vicious cycle of where these rats and these fleas and this plague are going. So the rats carried the plague. They followed the Mongols from Asia. And they're specific. These types of rats are specifically known to very quickly reproduce. They're called black rats. So that means more rats, means more fleas, means more plague, which means more dead. And the ships that were heading out of Kaffa, because of this plague that was already spreading, they go to Constantinople, which directly connects, I should say, to the Silk Road, which sends this plague back to Asia to kill off even more people. And eventually, in a span of 5 years, all of Europe is overrun by this plague. If you think about 5 years, that is a very insignificant amount of time for an area as large as Europe. And it's almost like the perfect storm of expanding trade routes, lack of sanitation, lack of knowledge around medical practices. So this plague ends up spreading at the worst time for humans. I guess it would be the best time if you're the plague, if you're on the team plague, best time for them. And it was a mix of booming populations in these busy trade cities combined with the lack of sanitation. It made these cities where these rats ended up the perfect breeding ground for the rats. And eventually for the people that were carrying the plague. The knowledge of medicine at that point was so rudimentary compared to what it is now, or even what it was 100, 200, 300 years later after this. There was no way for even the most educated doctors to do anything to try to combat this illness other than trial and error and see what works. Spoiler alert, nothing really worked other than you either get the plague and you die, or you get the plague and then you survive. That's really the two options that most people had. So what we know now is that the rats would carry these fleas that are infected with the plague. And the fleas then infected the rats, and the rats would die, and then the fleas would be left to their own devices to find a new host. Now, the new host would either be another rat, small mammal, or a human. Now, the fleas would hop into the clothing, into the hair of the nearest human that they possibly could, the next host, if you will, and then bite that person and directly infect them with the plague. Now, when the host dies, this flea that just gave the host the plague is sitting there trying to find the next possible host. And the type of flea that actually spread the plague that we know of is called the oriental flea, or the rat flea. It's very resilient. And these fleas can live for up to a month without a host. So they had ample time to latch on to a new being once their last host had perished. Now, in the height of the outbreak, there are a few different reasons for the plague, according to people living then. Now we know it was the fleas going around biting everyone. But the most popular theory was that God was furious, and it was striking down upon the people for living in sin. Other theories, mainly in Paris is where this comes from, is that the medical clinics believed that the plague was brought on by an unusual conjunction of Saturn and Mars and Jupiter, so they're looking up to the stars to explain what was happening here on Earth. But when those two theories of what is spreading this plague and what's causing it don't really do it for you, you can always do what people have done forever, is just blame others. So there's other groups that people are completely ostracizing and they're completely blaming. So people are saying, oh, well, no, it's the Jewish population in the area in Europe right now that's doing this. Some people are saying, no, it's the beggars. Oh, no, it's the traders coming from Asia. It's anybody that's not us. That is not me from my city and my group. They were even blaming people if you had acne at the time. They're saying, oh, no, it must be starting because of the pimples that you have, because of the pimples on your face. So that's no good if you're trying to fight acne. Imagine being a teenager. You're already sitting there self-conscious as it is. You're in your formative years, trying to fit in, trying to get a girlfriend because of your acne. Hey, maybe somebody really likes you for who you are. Nope, never mind. Don't date that person. They're the reason the plague's here. It's no good for those kids. So that's really what started the plague. Where it began and how it began its spread through Europe. So when we come back, we're going to cover a couple more things here. We're going to talk about the symptoms. I want to dive a little bit more into what the plague actually did to someone. What's the timetable of this plague spread? How did the people in the cities react? What was the impact that it had? What were some of the hardest hit cities in the mid-1300s because of this? So we'll cover some of those things when we come back. Normally I'd say I'll say what's up to that, but in this case I'll say what's up to living. I'll say what's up to not having the plague right now. I'll say what's up to that. Right. Okay, now that we are back, and we have already discussed the events that led to the widespread pestilence, Black Plague, the Great Death, the Bubonic Plague in Europe in the mid-1300s, let's talk about some of the symptoms. What actually happened to you when you got the plague? To start off, someone who was carrying the plague didn't show symptoms right away. They were very much asymptomatic, which made quarantining and isolating the members of the population that were infected by the plague very, very difficult. It was very difficult to pinpoint who did and who did not have it because, after all, they felt completely okay. It's not like they had the medical advancements of today where we could just do a quick test and see if you are positive. They just had to kind of sit back and wait and find out. So the carrier in question, someone who was sick with the plague, could go days and up to even a week with no symptoms. So it made it very difficult for these people to combat this sickness. So someone would be completely fine, and then in a lot of cases, within a day, they would be seriously ill or even dead. Once the symptoms began, the person in question that does indeed have the plague would start to feel a little bit off. They would start to get boils developing in their body folds. So their armpits, the groin region, their neck. These boils would form that could be the size of an apple. It was crazy. Like a large egg sitting on the side of your neck. And once these boils began to arrive, they would quickly turn to a dark blue or black coloring. And they would start to fester and fester. And the bigger they got, they would eventually burst, sending all of the goo out of that boil all over the place, which was very infectious. Made it very easy to transmit this plague because of what's coming out of these boils of everyone. Typically, it's accompanied by fever, stomach pains, headache, diarrhea, sweat, chills. All of these different things could be what you're feeling. And usually once you get to this stage, it is followed by death. But some people did survive. Even some of the people that survived the plague seemed to feel better. According to the CDC, they say when you survive the plague, your immune system is built up so much, you're almost feeling better than you were before. But the plague can be contracted with very minimal contact with someone ill. And oftentimes you didn't even know that this person was sick because they're not showing the symptoms yet. So coming in contact with this person, being in very close quarters. Remember, as I had said earlier, these fleas could jump 1.5 feet, 2 feet to get to a new carrier. So if they were jumping around, if they were on your clothes, in your hair, in your beard, what have you. And all of this happened very quickly. It was a very rampant spread of the plague. In a span of 5 years, Europe went from business as usual to being completely shut down. And some of these cities were hit so hard by the plague that they just completely became ghost towns and the inhabitants completely left. And this would then cause the forests to grow and really reclaim the area. In fact, after World War I, airplanes flying through Europe, aerial photographers were taking pictures of the woods. And from above, they could see what were almost like remains of towns. So then people would go in, unknown to the locals completely that lived there, they would go in and start to deforest the area. And they would uncover these towns that people once lived in the mid-1300s that they had no idea was there, just because that forest had reclaimed the area and became a ghost town. In fact, Europe took nearly 150 years after the plague had ended to get to pre-plague population, which is crazy thinking about. 150 years to undo the population decline of something that took 5 years to spread. And some of these areas, some of these cities that were hit incredibly hard by the plague included Florence, Italy. Up to 90% of the population perished due to the Black Plague. Hamburg, Germany, 70% of the population. 50% of the population in London. In fact, England as a whole declined pre-plague about 7 million people in the mid-1350s, and by 1400 only had 2 million people. The plague wiped out England. A majority of. In the worst year recorded in the city of Paris, France, 80,000 people were said to have died in 1 year. It's wild. So what are some of the treatments that they had? As we had mentioned previously, there's almost no way for these educated doctors to combat this sickness. But some of the remedies included bloodletting. If you're not too familiar with what that is, that's the assumption that your body has too much blood and the excess blood in your body is causing your body to go out of whack and give you an imbalance. So these doctors would then cut arteries and veins in your neck and your arms, trying to let out some of the blood. But draining too much blood is not good for someone, especially if there's a plague in the area. So that could very quickly lead to one of these doctors trying to save you, but actually killing you. And the next thing they tried would be lancing the boils, which would be just to stab the boils, that those apple-sized, egg-sized boils that are growing on you, just stab them. But this could kill the person due to toxic shock very quickly. And the matter that's inside of these boils, like I said moments ago, could spread the plague, is highly contagious. So it's almost as if you're doing more harm than good by trying to save this person. Another thing that they would try is to soak the victim of the plague in a vat of vinegar. That did nothing. You're not going to just go sit there in vinegar. You smell a little weird for a little bit, but you're not going to be feeling any better. And in fact, these doctors' remedies did so little to combat what was going on, and the death toll was so high that oftentimes these priests in the area stopped even performing last rites on these people that were sick with the plague. One, because of the volume, because so many people were getting sick and dying, but also because they were in danger of getting sick because they were too close to these persons that were infected. So as soon as you have the priest kind of saying, hey, I'm no longer going to be performing this duty, it's bad. And very interestingly, there was a group of people called the flagellants, if you will, that would look at the cause of the plague and say, it really is God, and God is mad at us. So in order to repent for the sins of humanity, this group of people would go through cities with whips and chains and belts, and they would flog themselves. So as they're walking through the cities, they would be whipping their own backs, causing these really deep and heinous cuts. And they would go from city to city to city, trying to recruit people, saying the more people we get in this group professing these sins, the quicker God will forgive us. And in fact, this group of people, the flagellants, they actually did a pretty darn good job of surviving compared to the whole, because most of the time they were traveling from city to city. They weren't in the middle of these plague-infested, rat-infested, sickness-infested centers, these city centers. They were outside in the woods, going from one place to the next. They wouldn't spend time amongst the sinners, so they would go out and they would pray, and they would repent to God and whip themselves. So they actually did a pretty good job of surviving. So that's the plague. That is what caused the plague to spread through Europe. Some of the symptoms of the plague, what happened in Europe, some of the hardest hit cities. Like I said, that is so crazy. 90% of Florence, Italy, huh? Wow. Now, even though we don't have the bubonic plague cruising around, there have been outbreaks since then in Asia in the 1800s and China in the 1800s. What are the odds? But when the most recent, the 1800s, had a bubonic plague outbreak in China, it was near the city of Wuhan, China. Interesting. But according to the CDC, in the U.S., in the United States right now, we have an average of 7 cases of the Black Plague per year. The 2 states that usually see these cases pop up is Arizona and New Mexico. So these are the 2 states that tend to have the highest density of Black Plague victims. And the highest year in recent recollection, in 2006, there were 17 cases reported in the U.S. But fortunately, 30, 40, 50, 60% death rate is no longer usual. In 2006, when 17 cases of the Black Plague were actually recorded, only 2 of those people died, both of which were elderly and had compromised immune systems as it is. So with our advancements in medicine and our understanding of these sicknesses, we do a significantly better job. Even though we still do have a much higher amount of trade. We have worldwide trade, not just Asia and Europe at this point. We have people that are flying to and from major cities regularly. We have more major cities, higher densities of populations in major cities and out. But because of our basic sanitation, we wash our hands way more. We shower way more than the people did in the mid 1300s. So we're in a much better situation. Our understanding of medicine and how that works, significantly better. So we don't tend to see these outbreaks of the plague like throughout human history. But I suppose one thing to leave you with is just knowing full well that even though things are better, it's still not perfect. Humanity has had plagues and sickness spread throughout our history. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to stop moving forward. While I don't think this COVID-19 outbreak and pandemic that's going on right now is nearly that 30 to 60% death rate like you see, once again, depending on the study, in the Black Plague. But it's just a friendly reminder, people. Wash your hands. Take a shower. If you're not feeling well, go to the doctor. You can do that. Figure it out. I don't want the Black Plague to come back. I mean, in 2015, 4 people in the United States died of the Black Plague. Let's cut it out. Anyways, thank you very much for joining me on this journey discussing the Black Plague, the pestilence, the bubonic plague. I had a great time doing the research, even though some of the articles that I was reading, some of the videos I was watching and recordings I was listening to were a little bit morbid. But regardless, it's an important piece of human history. I hope you learned a little bit of something here. I had a great time doing it. That said, we'll see you for the next episode of the ISWUTT podcast. My name is Michael Graham, and I'll say what's up to that. Have a great night.